Hello again. You're on Office Hours with Mad Professor. I'm Liam. Today I'm going to be deconstructing one of the PragerU propaganda videos that are so popular on the internet. Prager University is a private right-wing group that produces flashy videos, partly animated, that are often superficially convincing to people who have no specialist knowledge of a topic. Since they cover a lot of topics on which I do have specialist knowledge, I'm going to take apart several of them over the coming months, as I find time and slip them in. Today I'm going to be discussing one where they have somebody saying that the Palestinians have been offered a state 5 times and have always turned it down for some reason, and that that's why there's no peace between Israel and Palestine, which is a blatant lie. Let's see the first big lie from their video. So, roll clip.
If Israel just allowed the Palestinians to have a state of their own, there would be peace in the Middle East, right? That's what you hear from UN ambassadors, European diplomats, and most college professors. But what if I told you that Israel has already offered the Palestinians a state of their own, and not just once, but on 5 separate occasions?
Well, what would I say? Well, that's easy. I'd say that you were a dishonest propagandist, or an idiot, or both. Take your pick. I would like to then be fair and walk through each of these supposed 5 times, and we'll look at these different claims. So we'll cut in small pieces of the claim itself in order to establish what he's arguing, and then I will present a counter to it using the actual evidence. So, first one here, back in the 1930s.
In 1936, the Arabs rebelled against the British and against their Jewish neighbors. The British formed a task force, the Peel Commission, to study the cause of the rebellion. The commission concluded that the reason for the violence was that 2 peoples, Jews and Arabs, wanted to govern the same land. The answer, the Peel Commission concluded, would be to create 2 independent states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, a 2-state solution. The suggested split was heavily in favor of the Arabs. The British offered them 80% of the disputed territory, the Jews the remaining 20%. Yet, despite the tiny size of their proposed state, the Jews voted to accept this offer. But the Arabs rejected it and resumed their violent rebellion. Rejection number 1.
Okay, this one is easy to knock out right away, but on a technicality, so we will actually take it seriously and dig into it a bit. But first off, on a technicality, he says Israel has offered a state to the Palestinians 5 times. Well, in the 1930s, Israel wasn't a country, so what could it offer? Nothing at all. The Israelis were themselves effectively colonized as well. This was a British colony in Mandatory Palestine. So, the Peel Commission. Where does it come from? Well, it was put together during the 1936 Arab Revolt, which was a sustained policing action on the part of the British against a Palestinian uprising in Mandatory Palestine, which combined strikes, boycotts, that sort of thing, with actual violence, stabbings, roadside bombings, this sort of thing, because Palestinians were a bit fed up with their colonial status, and they had been trying to get representation in the mandatory government comparable to what the Zionist Commission got in Palestine, and they were turned down by the government for that. They could get no actual political representation, and things kind of came to a head in 1936. So in 1937, a commission came together, and the British government set up a group to look at possible solutions to this. And one of the ones they came up with was, well, why don't we divide the territory up, and we'll create like an Arab state and a Jewish state out of it. Because by this point, because of British policies during the 1920s and early 30s, vast numbers of Zionists had moved to the country, where before, at the beginning of the mandate, the Zionist population was about 25,000. It was tiny. Whereas by this point, you're looking at about 600,000. Huge difference. So, the commission looked at various proposals for how to divide the land up. The video mentions one. There's actually at least 4 possible maps that they'd worked up, but they worked up this idea, and then they put it forward to the Zionists to ask, hey, WZO, what do you think of this idea? And, well, first off, the WZO did accept partition. That's true. But one thing that a Zionist apologist will never tell you is that they had a reason for accepting it. Accepting any state, no matter how small, provided international legitimacy, sovereignty, and the ability to open up unlimited immigration for Zionists and Jews. So, what would this have resulted in? Well, an army that could then conquer the state. A conspiracy theory, you say? No, because we have the actual private writings and journal entries from David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, and Chaim Weizmann, the President of the World Zionist Organization, both of whom suggested that taking whatever territory was offered was vital and that more territory could then promptly be conquered. Their words, not mine. So, I rate any claim that the WZO accepted partition as bullshit. How about the Palestinians? What were they offered? Well, actually, nothing, for several reasons. First off, there was no one to offer it to. The Palestinians had no government. There was no representation left in the mandate, and no representative government formed amongst the Palestinian Arabs, and what little leadership was either being killed during the Arab Revolt or chased into exile, and what little leadership there wasn't legitimate anyway. So they had no one to ask, and no one bothered to ask the Palestinian people. There was no vote there, so no government, no vote, ergo, no actual offer, because there's no one to offer it to. Second, it wasn't an offer of a state at all. The plan would have been to merge the rump territories with the Arab populations here with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, then called Transjordan. So it would not have resulted in a Palestinian state at all. It would have been simply moving these Palestinians into a different British client state. Third, there was never any actual offer at all. This makes the whole thing a complete and fantastic lie, because what did Britain do after looking at these four possible partition plans? Well, it understood that no state here would be viable. No division could work. The states would be too small, with too few natural resources, and not economically viable. They would also require massive ethnic cleansing operations because the populations are so heavily intermixed. So, the British government actually concluded the Peel Commission's work by saying partition doesn't work and not offering to either side. So, all we have so far is a thought experiment put out there and an investigation of the possibility of partition that the British government then decided could not happen. So, claim number one by PragerU, total nonsense. Let's hear claim number two now, shall we? Well, back to the video.
In November 1947, the UN voted to create two states. Again, the Jews accepted the offer. And again, the Arabs rejected it. Only this time, they did so by launching an all-out war. Rejection number two. Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria joined the conflict. But they failed. Israel won the war and got on with the business of building a new nation. Most of the land set aside by the UN for an Arab state, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, became occupied territory. Occupied not by Israel, but by Jordan.
All right, for 1948, we have a tricky one here. There are a lot of different factors involved in all of these. I'm going to focus in only on the details most directly relevant. So we'll leave out a lot of the UN role here and a lot of the different factions on different sides here and look solely at could a Palestinian state have come out of the issues in 1947 and 48? The simple answer is no, zero chance. First off, the UN division proposals in 1947 from UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, proposed division of the territories into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Okay, so far. But no discussion here of how that Palestinian state would have worked, and in fact, not a Palestinian state at all. Palestinian appears nowhere in any of the discussions here. It calls it Arab state, and the actual plan from their own documents suggests it would have been attached to Transjordan. Again, so no possibility of a Palestinian state out of the UN's approach here in 47, but Israeli policy made the UN's proposals moot anyway. And here's where things get tricky. This discussion, as many do, immediately makes the point here that the Arab armies attacked Israel. Right? Plucky little Israel immediately attacked by a whole bunch of Arab countries. Oh my goodness, it's a David and Goliath struggle. Well, yeah, only the Goliath was the Israelis, right? Not the Arab states. The Israelis were by far the stronger player in 1948, with a combined military force twice that of the troop strength of all 6 Arab states involved combined. But let's leave that out. Let's focus on the Palestinian issue. Well, were the Palestinians involved in this at all? Not really. Palestinians had no real weapons by this point, no leadership, no real will to resist. That had been broken in 3 horribly bloody years fighting the British and the Zionists in the 1936-39 Arab Revolt. So, fights in 1947? Not much of them. But while initially the Zionist paramilitaries held back, they quickly went on the offensive. And by the beginning of 1948, we're actually moving well beyond the territory that the UN partition plan had allotted to them. Note that the UN had actually suggested keeping Jerusalem and Bethlehem as a UN mandatory territory permanently under international control so that all 3 major religions could share it equally and there'd be no fighting over it. Well, this was entirely unacceptable to the Zionists. So, they launched ground offensives to push Palestinians out and gobble up more territory in the course of this, and drove up to Jerusalem. They extended their control, in fact, in quite a few different areas, gobbling up far, far more of the territory than would have been given to them under the UN plan. Going from about 55% to about 78%, right? Nearly all of it. So then from here, you have the whole range of ethnic cleansing operations that took place during the 1948 war. 400 different Palestinian villages were depopulated by Zionist forces who surrounded them, shot into the air, and drove people out through an opening, along with a few occasional small massacres. Massacres were not the normal way that this was carried out, but it happened a few times, we should grant that. But massive ethnic cleansing, right? And again, all of this driven from the Zionist side. So what about those 6 Arab armies? They only invaded afterwards. They invaded after the Zionists had been fighting for months to chase Palestinians out of their homes and to expand their area of control for a potential state. So by the time it came to Israel declaring its independence in May of 1948 at the expiry of the British Mandate, then the Arab states announced war and launched an invasion, but it was hardly unprovoked, right? They were at this point stepping into the struggle. But could a Palestinian state have emerged out of that? What if the Arab states had won? The simple answer is not a chance, because not one of those Arab states was fighting on behalf of Palestinians or of Palestinian state. They were fighting against the Zionist movement and its intrusion into the Arab world. All right, this is a time of growing Arab nationalism, a desire by the Arabs to chase out European influence, to kind of escape the stain of colonialism and become stronger. They wanted more territory in it. The Arab states involved all had their own territorial ambitions here. They were not planning on creating a Palestine as a separate country there. The territory would have been divided up and annexed by the Arab states. So again, claim number 2, complete horseshit. Let's see what he has for number 3. I think we can guess. How about the 1967 war? Roll tape.
20 years later, in 1967, the Arabs, led this time by Egypt and joined by Syria and Jordan, once again sought to destroy the Jewish state. The 1967 conflict, known as the Six-Day War, ended in a stunning victory for Israel. Jerusalem and the West Bank, as well as the area known as the Gaza Strip, fell into Israel's hands. The government split over what to do with this new territory. Half wanted to return the West Bank to Jordan and Gaza to Egypt in exchange for peace. The other half wanted to give it to the region's Arabs, who had begun referring to themselves as the Palestinians, in the hope that they would ultimately build their own state there. Neither initiative got very far. A few months later, the Arab League met in Sudan and issued its infamous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Again, a 2-state solution was dismissed by the Arabs, making this rejection number 3.
Okay, first off here, the 1967 war is vastly more complex than he admits here, and in fact there's quite a few disingenuous points, like the suggestion that Syria is involved from the very beginning when they were not. Syria did not get involved actually in the military conflict in 1967 until Israel launched an invasion of Syrian territory. Several days into the war. When the war broke out, the Syrians sat on their hands and did nothing, afraid to get involved because they saw what was happening here. The Israelis struck first in 1967 war, though to be fair, they were provoked to it by a blockade, by moving of Egyptian troops into the Sinai Peninsula, into forward positions in actual contravention of Nasser's orders, but his generals were determined to find a way to strike at Israel and make up for the earlier losses in 1948, 1956, so they assumed forward positions to provoke Israel. This worked, and war broke out. But when Israel struck first, it struck first hard and effectively, destroying the Egyptian Air Force on the ground and establishing a dominant position in both the Sinai and in the fights with Jordanian troops in the West Bank. And then, only then, several days into the fight, did Israeli troops roll into the Golan Heights, attacking Syria. And now, again, the 67 war itself, quite a complicated issue. We don't need to get into the details here. We're concerned with, could a Palestinian state have come out of the 67 war? The answer is easy. Not a chance. It was never discussed. It was never proposed. There was zero possibility of this. Again, the Arab states were fighting for their own reasons and their own benefit. And just consider, where do most Palestinians live in this point? Well, just as today, in the West Bank, right? And the West Bank, after the 1948 war, had been legally and formally annexed to the Kingdom of Transjordan, which renamed itself the Kingdom of Jordan. So it was part of Jordan, and those Palestinians were offered Jordanian citizenship. So to suggest that had the Arab states won in 1967, a Palestinian state could have been offered there, that it was even remotely possible, this is wildly disingenuous. You know, the West Bank was part of Jordan. Where does a Palestine fit into this at all? It doesn't. It's simply impossible. It's an absurd claim. I almost forgot to mention, after the 1967 war, the Israelis immediately began settling the West Bank. So where could a Palestinian state have come from out of that? How is, again, to use the language he uses at the beginning of this video, Israel offered the Palestinians a state? Well, where does that come in? The Allon Plan, put into action after the 1967 war, involved setting up strategic settlements all across the West Bank, locking in particular areas, surrounding heavily urbanized Palestinian areas to concentrate them, and involved huge seizures of land. Along with, small chunks of land, but symbolically important. The fifth quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, the Maghrebi quarter, was bulldozed after the 1967 war immediately in order to create that nice wide open-air plaza that Jews love today to go and visit the Western Wall. Now you can see a whole bunch of the wall where there used to be a neighborhood right there. Long gone now. But the Allon Plan put settlements all across the West Bank, and discussions in the succeeding decades usually focused on what they called a Jordanian option, whereby if any kind of peace deal could be worked out with the surrounding Arab states, a few cantonments, a few isolated areas of dense Palestinian concentration would have been handed over to Jordan, and a bunch of the rest of the territory kept, including the Jordan Valley along the border with Jordan, would have been kept. The area in and around Jerusalem would have been kept. A number of border areas would have been kept in order to push the border farther back and widen the coast strip. But a few areas might have been turned over to Jordan under the Jordanian option, and again, not to a Palestinian state. So putting 1967 into this picture at all makes no sense at all unless you are intentionally meaning to mislead people. And I think it's pretty clear that that is the goal of this video. But let's see what he has next.
In 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak met at Camp David with Palestinian Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat to conclude a new two-state plan. Barak offered Arafat a Palestinian state in all of Gaza and 94% of the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. But the Palestinian leader rejected the offer. In the words of U.S. President Bill Clinton, Arafat was here 14 days and said no to everything. Instead, the Palestinians launched a bloody wave of suicide bombings that killed over 1,000 Israelis and maimed thousands more on buses, in wedding halls, and in pizza parlors. Rejection number 4.
Okay, this fourth one that he brings up in the video is admittedly a little more complicated to explain, as will be the fifth one. So let's take a look at this. The discussion here is around the Barak-Arafat discussions across the year 2000, eventually culminating in meetings with President Clinton at Camp David trying to hash out a plan. And the common story here goes that at Camp David, the Israelis offered a state to the Palestinians, and Arafat said, no, not good enough, and turned down peace again. That's the propaganda about it. Let's take a look at what actually was being offered, because it's not what you think it is. First off, by this point, you have decades worth of settlement construction in the West Bank. Particularly from the rise to power of the Likud in 1977, settlement construction took off, and all across the 1980s, vast numbers of Zionist settlements appeared in the West Bank, carving it up into little cantonments and making any kind of contiguous Palestinian territory effectively impossible. That was already well in place in the 1980s. In the 1990s, during the Oslo process, which was supposed to be a peace process aiming toward a Palestinian state, the discussions under Yitzhak Rabin, that period in the 1990s actually saw a doubling of the settler population. All through the 1990s, while Israelis were supposedly aiming at long-term peace with the Palestinians, they were seizing vast tracts of territory and moving more Zionists into the West Bank. Again, with the intent of making a contiguous Palestinian state impossible. By 2000, when Arafat is meeting Barak to discuss the creation of a possible state and a peace settlement, that has borne fruit. That has made an actual state impossible, and you can see this in what Barak is actually offering. First off, the settlement blocks, nearly all of them would have been annexed to Israel. So, tons of areas along the border would have taken in tons of territory there. There would have been little lines carving up into the West Bank to take in things like the Ariel settlement that neatly bisects the northern West Bank, and moving eastward from Jerusalem to take in Ma'ale Adumim, again bisecting the West Bank as a whole, so breaking it into, 4 major chunks. And have carved along here into little pieces. You've got all the settlements down near Hebron, or aka Al Khalil. You've got tons of settlements around there that would have been kept by Israel in the peace deal. So the Palestinian state would have been non-contiguous. Next, the Jordan Valley would have been kept, which means that a Palestinian state would not have had a border with any other Arab state. They would have had to continue to pass through Israeli territory, and Israel and all of its settlements would have maintained permanent control of the Jordan Valley. And the argument given is security considerations. We don't trust the Arab neighbors, which is fantastically nonsensical, since in 1994 a formal peace deal was signed with Jordan, ending the conflict with Jordan, establishing perfect friendly relations. So why do you need to patrol that border? What possible threat is Jordan anymore? You have a formal peace deal with them. Not to mention they'd had close cooperation with the Jordanians off and on since before the state existed, but never mind that. So here we're keeping the Jordan Valley, here we're keeping all these different settlement blocks, and access to a significant amount of the natural resources of the West Bank. So what is being offered to Arafat here? First off, a demilitarized state that has no control over its own airspace, no access to the sea even. Like the Israelis would have effective control over the seaboard of Gaza. So any kind of seaport would have to have Israeli control there. Israelis would interfere in its airspace, so any airport built there, the Israelis would be involved in that. There could be no formal military. They could have police, but no actual army or air force or anything like that could be part of a Palestine. No control over its land borders, so no access to any other Arab states. It would remain effectively an Israeli colony and carved up into a series of tiny little cantonments without any kind of land contiguity. So, what kind of state is this? In addition, there's the question of East Jerusalem and the Old City, which is a major sticking point for Palestinians in any negotiations. Now, I understand this is important to both sides here, but some sort of arrangement to share the Temple Mount, aka Noble Sanctuary, would have to be worked out here. Both sides wanted some kind of control over it. And here comes one of the major problems that all Israeli governments would actually have. Even if Barak had sincerely offered control of the Temple Mount to Arafat, which he did not, but even if he had done that, it could not have passed. Barak's coalition in the Knesset would immediately have collapsed. With a no confidence vote, he would have lost his governing majority, and new elections would have to be called, and that would be the end of those negotiations, because a significant part of the Israeli Knesset would have no part whatsoever in turning over control of any part of the Temple Mount to Arafat. Even control over the Christian and Muslim quarters of the Old City would have been deeply contentious within Israeli circles. So, still, control over East Jerusalem, problematic. And of course, by this point, given the settlement process, there are rings of settlements all around East Jerusalem, effectively cutting it off from the rest of the Palestinian urban areas. So it couldn't be much of a functioning capital either. So that gets to be problematic. Finally, the speaker completely mischaracterizes the positions of all three of the major parties. Clinton frequently had to criticize Barak for actually coming up with no real concrete offers for Arafat and just standing there kind of, we'll give them something, but giving no actual offer which could be accepted by any Palestinian leader. So Clinton is frequently having to chide his own friendly side with the Israelis there over that lack. The final deal crafted, the final actual plan put together, was largely done by the Clinton administration with no real input from the Israelis. And when it finally came out and they discussed this, Barak made it clear to both Clinton and Arafat that he would not be able to get support for this deal through the Knesset, that he would not be able to get it passed. He admitted that there. And of course, that means Arafat's going to turn it down. Why would Arafat accept a deal that isn't actually a deal, that wasn't actually an offer? And this again is where the video completely mischaracterizes the issue here of an offer of a Palestinian state, because again, there was no offer at all. Barak would not put one together. Clinton's offer was rejected by Barak, who said he could not get it passed. So Arafat said, well, if you guys don't actually have an offer for me, I guess this was a giant waste of time. And here we are criticizing Arafat for turning down an offer that wasn't actually an offer. We're criticizing Arafat for saying, well, since you didn't actually offer me anything, I guess we don't have a deal. And saying that there was an offer? That's a complete lie. So we've got 4 down now. Let's see the 5th big lie in this wonderful video. So, roll the clip.
In 2008, Israel tried yet again. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert went even further than Ehud Barak had, expanding the peace offer to include additional land to sweeten the deal. Like his predecessor, the new Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, turned the deal down. Rejection number 5.
Now, one of the things that makes the 2008 deal a little bit more complicated is that it depends upon some of the earlier context in the early 2000s, in particular what's sometimes called the Second Intifada or the Al-Aqsa Intifada, which actually helped to topple the Barak government. The speaker had mentioned the waves of suicide bombings, but of course gave no indication of where they were coming from. Ariel Sharon had taken a delegation up onto the Temple Mount in a deliberate provocation intending to inflame tensions and piss the Palestinians off enough that they would fight back, which of course they did and got upset, and that he then spun in the media into Barak is weak and you need me as a strong leader and I will blah 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 take care of things, and he then promptly won an election to be prime minister. So that's the beginning of the 2000s there. And a lot of these attacks that follow there are, simply a predictable response to the provocations. Well, the 2008 deal comes along with Sharon's successor, Ehud Olmert, and trying to work out one last attempt at negotiations. And in some ways, this one is a little easy to deal with because it actually mirrors the 2000 negotiations to a large degree. Simply put, nothing that is proposed in this video actually happened. Olmert knew going into these negotiations in 2008 that he did not have the votes in the Knesset to pass any kind of deal that would have turned over territory and created a Palestinian state. He simply could not have done it. And this was well known inside the political and diplomatic circles, but of course not well discussed in the media. Behind closed doors, the negotiations here are proceeding with the same kind of double dealing that we see in the 2000 ones, with no actual plan and nothing truly being offered. So Olmert is kind of dancing around it a bit. Well, of course, we'll want to keep some of the settlement blocks, and we'll want some security arrangements. And Mahmoud Abbas, Arafat's successor, is sitting there going, well, okay, show me what you mean. Can we see a map of what you're talking about? Can we see a map of what is actually being proposed? So we can see if this actually is a state in any way. And Olmert says, no, no possible map. I think at one point they drew on the back of a napkin a faint outline of something, and even there was like, what? You can't get any real detail out of that. But no map, no concrete suggestion, no description of what's being offered. What Olmert was insisting happen is that Abbas accept in principle the idea of a Palestinian state under whatever conditions the Israelis could give. And again, he knows that he cannot go to the Knesset with any kind of deal that would have given any sort of substantive state to the Palestinians, any kind of actual territory to the Palestinians. Olmert knows he can't get there through the Knesset. He doesn't have a strong enough coalition to do so. Which means what he's doing is he's trying to back Abbas into a corner, get him to accept just carte blanche, blank sheet of paper, nothing on there, accept a state. Sign that you'll take whatever we give you. Then he knows, Olmert knows, he can go back to the Knesset and start the horse trading there. Come up with any kind of deal that he can manage to get through, which would have been undoubtedly far worse even though it was offered in 2000. Right? Which again, mind you, was a series of disconnected cantonments, control over the airspace and waterways and internal transportation, a completely demilitarized state with no access to land borders with any other Arab state, basically a permanent form of colonialism with the bare illusion of sovereignty. It would not have been an actual state. That's the 2000 deal here. And this would have been even harder to push through in 2008, especially since, again, settlements continue to rise in number and the settler parties continue to rise in power within Israel. So Olmert knows he could not get a good deal through. And he was trying to get Abbas to accept anything that he could then go back and get the Knesset to hand any little crumbs. And this doesn't work. No Palestinian leader could accept a deal like that and actually survive politically. He would have been immediately replaced, and rightfully so, because he would have sold out all of the Palestinians' demands: the right of return of refugees, control over East Jerusalem, access to the Temple Mount, a contiguous state, anything. He would have sold out every possible demand in exchange for whatever possible crumbs the Knesset was willing to propose, even if Olmert could have gotten a deal through, which is not by any means certain. He might have gotten absolutely nothing, even if Abbas had completely surrendered and accepted anything. So, the video arguing that this is an offer of a Palestinian state is a bald-faced lie. It is nothing but propaganda. This was not an offer of a Palestinian state. This could not have gone anywhere. It could not have been approved by the Israelis. It could not have been approved by anyone. The Arabs didn't turn down an actual offer. What they turned down was yet another colonial con. This means that both the 2000 and 2008 deals, Israel was a dishonest negotiating partner, and it walked in with no actual intention of handing over any kind of truly sovereign state to the Palestinians, and it simply wanted them to accept what in effect sound a lot like the old apartheid South African Bantustans. Here, we'll carve a little part out of our country, a little circle right here that you can live in, and we'll pretend that's a real country. No one else pretended that they were countries. Every other country in the world understood that the Bantustans were not countries. But South Africa liked to pretend that they were, even though they retained total control over those areas. That, in effect, is what's being offered here. So the video saying that this is any kind of offer of a state is wildly disingenuous, and this is the only time of the 5 supposed times that the video suggests that there is an offer of a state to the Palestinians. This is the only 2 times that there even was any negotiation, right? Because, 1967 and 1948 and 1937, none of them have anything to do with the Palestinians at all. The Palestinians aren't even involved in any of those earlier 3 attempts. These 2, in 2000 and 2008, are the only times the Israelis actually sit down even to negotiate with them. And the negotiation is based on a lie. It's based on a cheap con with no actual plan being proposed and no path to passing a peace deal in the Knesset. So, I rate this video a complete fabrication. So, hopefully this has helped a bit to demystify a bit of the negotiation issues and why there isn't a Palestinian state. If you find these videos valuable, be sure to subscribe, like the video, etc., etc. Once again, Office Hours with Mad Professor. My name is Liam, and I'll see you again next time.